Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Wings of the Eagle, a World War II spy thriller by J. Toner. Narrated by Gildart Jackson. Part 1. The British. Chapter 1. Friday, April the 9th, 1943. It was time to jump, but Kurt's legs refused to move. The officer grabbed him by the arm and dragged him to the open door. Outside, powerful searchlights lit up the sky, and the plane rocked and juddered as anti-aircraft shells exploded all around them. Waves of panic swept over Kurt. His stomach heaved. He tried to remember what the instructor had said. Spread your arms and legs like a starfish. Tuck and roll on landing. And there was something else. Count to 10 slowly before you pull the cord. At that moment, there was a blinding flash in the air outside. The plane bucked under the accompanying explosion. "Don't think about it," shouted the officer in his ear. "Just count to 20 and pull the cord. You'll be fine." It was that count to 20 that did it. It distracted Kurt just enough to allow him to let go. He fell through the open door, spread his arms and legs, and counted to 20. As soon as he pulled the cord, he knew he was in trouble. Only half of his parachute filled with air. One of the cords that should have been attached to the canopy was flapping uselessly around his head, and he was dropping like a stone. Chapter 2. 3 weeks earlier. Kurt Muller stood in darkness, staring through the window at the Dublin street below. Diffused by a heavy drizzle, the light from the street lamps perfectly mirrored the conflicted state of his thoughts. To his right, Anna lay sleeping in her bed, clutching her rag doll. Like any 10-year-old, Anna's view of the world was uncomplicated and innocent. Since the day of their escape from Nazi Germany, she had accepted Kurt as her papa, and she was as dear to him now as if she were his own. How could he explain to her that he had to leave, that he might never return? Gudrun appeared by his side, wrapped in a dressing gown. "Come back to bed, Kurt," she whispered. "We can talk about it in the morning." He shook his head. "No, Gudrun, I've made up my mind." She gripped his arm. "You agreed to wait a year. You wouldn't last a day in Berlin, you know that." The Third Reich had suffered a number of serious reversals in the 10 months since their escape, but the latest news was of a successful counter-offensive on the Eastern Front. It seemed the war would never end. Kurt said, "I can't wait any longer." "Keep your voice down, Kurt." Gudrun peered at her daughter in the half-light. "At least wait until after Anna's birthday." He lowered his voice again. "Every day that passes is killing me, Gudrun. Can't you see that? I have to go back." The light from the street lamps caught tears in her eyes. "What can you do? You are only one man." "You may be right, Gudrun, but I have to do what I can." She moved away from him then. "And what about me? What about Anna and me? What if the Gestapo catches you and you die over there?" He reached out to her. She put her arms on his chest to push him away, but he drew her close. "They won't catch me, and I will come back. I promise." Professor Stefan Hirsch welcomed Kurt with a firm handshake and a broad grin. "By all that's holy, it's Kurt Muller, the Nazi killer. What are you doing back in Ireland?" The professor's American accent hadn't changed, but he had aged 10 years in the 12 months since Kurt had last seen him. "Things got a bit difficult for me in Berlin after the death of Reinhard Heydrich," said Kurt. "I barely got out in one piece. I expect the Nazis are hunting me." "You're right," said the professor solemnly. "There's a price on your head since the assassination." "You're still in touch with the Black Orchestra in Berlin?" I am, although my role has diminished somewhat since Heydrich died. I communicate with your friends in the Abwehr from time to time. I take it you plan to sit out the rest of the war here?" The university was in recess. Professor Hirsch's rooms on the third floor overlooked a front square almost denuded of students. Kurt shook his head. "I intend to go back to Germany." The professor coughed. "Not a good idea, Kurt. If those bastards catch sight of you, you'll be dog meat. If you're looking for work, I could find you something in the maths department." "Thanks, Professor, but my mind's made up. I thought I might work for the British." The professor snorted. "You're crazy. The British will never trust you, given your background in the Abwehr." Kurt tapped the side of his head. "I have some solid intelligence to trade." "That could make a difference," said the professor. "But if they do decide to use you, they're certain to want to send you back to Germany." "I'm banking on it, Professor. What I need from you is a name, someone in British intelligence to contact." "I can do better than that, Kurt. What are you calling yourself?" "Kevin O'Reilly." The professor picked up the telephone and spoke to the operator. "Get me Huntington 26 in Cambridgeshire. Tell them Professor Stefan Hirsch would like to speak with General Sir Hugh Anderton." "They've agreed to meet you," said the professor as he replaced the telephone receiver. "They'll make contact when you arrive at Euston Station." As Kurt was leaving, the professor gave him one last word of advice. "Trust no one, Kurt. Treat everyone you meet as a potential double agent." Captain Johnson of the Office of Strategic Services, U.S. Military Intelligence, sat at his desk in a dingy office in London WC1. The door opened. A U.S. Marine entered and saluted. "We've had a call from Piper, sir. That's the math professor in Ireland." The captain took a sip from the grey liquid congealing in his cup and grimaced. "I know who Piper is, Professor Hart. What does he want?" "That's Professor Hirsch, sir. He's sent us details about a member of the Abwehr who's in Dublin and planning to join the British operation. He'll be travelling to London in the next day or two." "Could be a Nazi plant. What do we know about him?" "Name of Kevin O'Reilly. Something of a math genius, according to the professor. And Hirsch reckons he's legit." Captain Johnson snorted. "Who do we have free?" "I've asked Willoughby to sit on his tail." "Okay, keep me informed, and get me a fresh cup of whatever the British call this revolting dreck." As the mailboat Cambria slipped away from the dock at Dunlayer and headed for the mouth of the harbour, Kurt stood at the railing and waved to the three people who meant the most to him in the world. He was facing an uncertain future. If the British rejected him, he would have to spend the remainder of the war behind bars in a British POW or internment camp. If his plan succeeded and the British took him on as an agent, he could expect to find himself back in Germany, risking capture, torture, and death. Either way, he might never see Gudrun, Anna, or his mother again. In the pocket of his jacket he carried a parcel containing a set of forged German papers in the name of Frederick von Schoenholtz. This was the bogus identity he had used to escape from Nazi Germany nearly 10 months earlier. It was the one thing that could get him out of a jam, his trump card, and the one thing that he intended to keep secret from the British. The sun sank below the land to the west as the ship turned into the choppy waters of the Irish Sea. A cold wind laced with spray drove the passengers inside. Kurt found a stool at the bar and ordered a pint of Guinness. The man at the next stool tried to strike up a conversation, but Kurt picked up his beer and moved away. At disembarkation in Holyhead, he was met by a military checkpoint. A British soldier in uniform checked his passport. "Kevin O'Reilly from Dublin, and where are you headed, son?" "London," Kurt replied. "I'm enlisting." "Good man," said the soldier, handing the passport back. Chapter 3. SS Hauptsturmführer Bismarck Lange lowered his portly posterior into a chair and dropped his leather briefcase on the floor beside him. He was sweating, although the temperature in Necker's office was not uncomfortable. "Glad you could come," said his host. SS Sturmbannführer Necker was wearing his dress uniform and a supercilious smile. "We have a lot to talk about. When was the last time we met?" Lange ground his teeth. Necker knew the answer to that question. Surely the aristocratic prick was not about to bring up their last encounter and rub his nose in it. Before Lange could frame a suitable reply, Necker jumped from his desk. "Give me a moment," he said, and he left the room, closing the door behind him. That was typical behavior for Necker. The man was all smoke and mirrors. This latest illusion was of a man with important business that required his immediate attention in another room, a subordinate who needed to be reprimanded, perhaps, or an important report that had to be checked before it was handed to someone upstairs. Lange ran his eyes over the top of Necker's desk. He was itching to see what his nemesis was working on, but the folders on there were tantalizingly just out of reach, and it was an obvious trap. Instead, he lifted his briefcase onto his lap, flipped it open, extracted a silver hip flask, and took a quick swig. Seconds later, the flask was back in the briefcase, and the briefcase was on the floor. Necker swept back into his office and returned to his seat. "Now, where were we?" SS Sturmbannführer Necker of the SD was from an aristocratic family. Thin as a coyote, he was 1.85 meters tall, with blonde hair cut short in the military style. Lange, on the other hand, was the son of a barber. He had a glandular condition that made it difficult to control his weight, and he barely met the minimum height for the SS. The fact that, despite these disadvantages, he had risen to his current rank was a continual source of personal satisfaction to him. Lange seized the initiative. "You agreed to let me read your notes on deserters from the Eastern Campaign." "Yes, indeed I did, and you were to share your latest information on subversives in the universities. I take it you have the information with you?" Necker nodded toward Lange's briefcase. Lange opened his briefcase and extracted a thin file. Then, like duelists at dawn, Necker handed an equally thin file across the desk with one hand, while accepting Lange's offering with the other. Both men opened what they'd been given and began to read. "There's nothing but numbers in here. Don't you have the names of the deserters?" said Lange. Necker really was an unbelievable bastard. 6 months earlier they had been of equal rank, two ambitious young Gestapo men competing for a single promotion and transfer to the security service, the SD. It had gone to Necker. Right up until the moment when the announcement was made, Lange had been convinced that it would be his. He had earned it. He had sweated blood for it. But Necker had the breeding and the height, and they had given it to him. Since then, Necker and Lange had shared 3 major investigations, and in each case Lange had done all the work. It was Lange's men who had found and arrested the guilty party. It was Lange who had extracted the confessions, and yet Necker had somehow managed to claim all the glory. "This file contains nothing but a few names," Necker countered, touching the jagged dueling scar on his right cheek, a souvenir of his time at Heidelberg University. "What I wanted was an indication of the numbers involved, the number of universities suspected of harboring subversives, the numbers of students and staff arrested, and so forth." Lange pried his portly frame from the chair. Necker stood up to face him. That was when Langer first noticed that Necker's desk was mounted on a pedestal of 3 or 4 centimetres, making him appear even taller than he was. The 2 files were returned, each to its owner. Langer dropped his file into the briefcase and stepped toward the door. "I shall have my staff send those figures to you," said Langer. "And you shall have those names," replied Necker. When hell freezes, Langer thought. Before leaving, he turned, clicked his heels, and saluted. "Heil Hitler!" Necker gave a limp wave in reply and returned to the papers on his desk. On the train to London, Kurt found himself sharing a carriage with a young Irishman in an ill-fitting suit. No words were exchanged, but Kurt noticed his travelling companion casting a curious eye in his direction from time to time. London was more grimy than he remembered it, more grim. Euston Station was largely unscathed, but there was a smell of charred wood and rubble in the air. The young man presented his ticket at the barrier and made a beeline for a pub across the road. Before leaving the station, Kurt placed a small parcel with the left luggage office. A passing pedestrian gave him directions to the nearest public lending library, 15 minutes' walk away. The streets had been torn apart. There were piles of rubble where houses had been, their neighbours on either side propped up by wooden struts. The people looked weary, their clothes worn and faded, but all were quick to smile. In the library he found an obscure corner of the non-fiction section and slipped his luggage ticket inside a copy of Einstein's Theories, Space, Time and Relativity, which had clearly never been borrowed. Back at the street outside the railway station, he joined 5 others who were obviously waiting to be picked up. 3 minutes later, Kurt was alone and still waiting. His 5 fellow passengers had all gone. He wondered if General Anderton had forgotten to arrange for someone to meet him, or if he had missed his contact during his short trip to the library. He could imagine having to take the train and ferry home, his tail between his legs. He decided to get something to eat. He hadn't eaten for several hours, and his insides were churning. Maybe he'd be able to work out what to do next on a full stomach. As soon as he stepped inside the pub, he spotted the young man from the train sitting at the bar. Nearby, 4 Tommies in uniform sat at a table drinking pints. Kurt took the stool beside the young man and ordered a cheese sandwich and a pint of bitter. The stool to his right was occupied by a heavy-set man reading a newspaper. One of the Tommies stepped up to the bar between Kurt and the young man and ordered a round of drinks. Speaking out of the side of his mouth, he said, "You were on a train from Ireland, weren't you?" The young man smiled at him but said nothing. "Where are you headed?" asked the soldier. "I'm here to meet someone," said the young man. "Oh, you're Irish," said the Tommy. "I knew you weren't a squaddy. I wondered." The soldier took his drinks back to his companions at the table. Almost immediately the barracking started, as the Tommies took it in turns to call out to the young man, accompanied by raucous laughter. "Who needs the Irish drinking our beer? Taking our jobs, humping our women. Why don't you go home where you belong, Paddy? They're neutral, these Irish bogmen, you know. Should be neutered, the lot of 'em, if you ask me." The young man put his glass down and slipped off the stool. Kurt put a hand on his arm, caught his eye, and said, "Leave it." The Irishman shook his head. He went over to the table and said, "What is your problem?" to the Tommies. "I should have thought that was obvious," said one of the soldiers. "Do you know there's a war on, Paddy?" The Irishman leaned across the table and knocked the man's drink over. There wasn't a lot left in the glass, but what there was ran down the squaddy's lap. He shot to his feet, knocking over the table and the drinks of his 3 mates. The landlord let out a yell from behind the bar. "Oi, take it outside!" "Suits me," said the Tommy. "And me," said the Irishman, and they both headed for the door. The other Tommies crowded outside, and Kurt followed them. The young man removed his jacket and handed it to Kurt. The Tommy handed his to one of his mates, and the 2 men faced off, fists raised. They circled each other like prize fighters, feinting, ducking, fists rolling. The other 3 Tommies stood around, jeering and encouraging their man. "Show him what a Brit can do! Give him one for me, Nobby!" "Queensberry rules," said the young man. "Whatever you like, ducky," said the soldier, and he threw a wild punch. The young man avoided that easily and countered with one of his own that struck his opponent on the ear. "Come on, Nobby, give it to him!" The crowd was gathering, and Kurt noticed the heavy-set man from the bar watching with a broad grin on his face. Nobby swung a second punch that caught the young man on the side of the face. He threw an uppercut in reply, but failed to make contact. The Tommies cheered. "Finish him off, Nobby!" Then the Tommy switched to wrestling, wrapping his arms around the young Irishman's midriff and knocking him to the ground. The Irishman broke free, but the Tommy landed a roundhouse punch that knocked him to the ground. The Tommy aimed a boot at the Irishman, who turned away in time, grabbed the Tommy's foot, and twisted. The Tommy gave a howl of pain and fell face down. Leaping to his feet, the Irishman placed a boot in the small of his opponent's back, effectively immobilizing him. The other 3 Tommies crowded forward to help their man. Outnumbered 4 to 1, the Irishman would soon be fighting for his life. "That's enough!" shouted Kurt, stepping forward. "Let him go, soldier. He's had enough." The spectators roared with laughter at this. "They're only getting started," complained one of the Tommies. "King's regulations forbid public brawling," said the heavy-set man. "Break it up." The Irishman released the Tommy, who regained his feet, scowling and brushing dirt from his uniform. Kurt handed the Irishman his jacket. The heavy-set man said, "Which one of you clowns is Kevin O'Reilly?" "That's me," said Kurt. "Major Weir." They shook hands. "General Anderton sent me to meet you." The Irishman fished a £1 note from a pocket and waved it in the air. "The next round is on me." The Tommies cheered and went back inside the pub with their newfound friend from Ireland. Kurt and Major Weir set off together at a brisk walk. After sitting on the mailboat and train for the best part of a day and a half, Kurt was glad of the exercise. London and the Londoners looked surprisingly cheerful, considering the hammering they had been receiving from the Luftwaffe. Kurt saw little signs of the bombings, just 2 thin plumes of smoke rising in the still air to the north. They walked for 15 minutes before turning into Kensington Palace Gardens, a wide, tree-lined street containing a row of stately houses. Weir pressed a buzzer on the gate-post of one of the houses, gave his name, and the gates swung open. The front door opened as they approached it. Kurt and the Major stepped inside, and the door was closed behind them by a soldier in uniform. Taking Kurt's bag and handing it to the soldier, Major Weir said, "Welcome to the cage." Chapter 4. 2 Tommies escorted Kurt down a flight of stairs to a basement corridor and into an interrogation room. There they strip-searched him. Kurt found the procedure humiliating, dehumanizing, although a small part of his mind found it comical. When the search was complete, his clothes were returned. The room was drab, grey, lacking windows, poorly lit, and equipped with 2 canteen chairs on either side of a plain wooden table. Within 30 minutes the door opened, and Kurt was joined by a rotund man in his early 60s, wearing a shabby military uniform. The officer sat down facing Kurt. "Welcome to England," he said, in perfect German. "Thank you," Kurt replied. "You may call me Colonel Scott," said the officer, continuing in German. "What is your full name and rank?" "Kevin O'Reilly, Oberleutnant." The colonel pursed his lips. "Your real name, if you don't mind." "Please understand, Colonel, I need to protect my real identity. I am a wanted man in Germany with a price on my head." "You're going to have to trust me," said the colonel. "I promise your name will not pass beyond these 4 walls." Kurt took a deep breath and said, "Kurt Muller, Oberleutnant." "A deserter from the Abwehr, I'm given to understand." The word shocked Kurt momentarily. He had not considered it before, but that's exactly what he was, a deserter. The word carried unpleasant connotations. Deserters were the lowest form of life in the eyes of the Wehrmacht. They could be shot on sight. "I'd like you to tell me your story,"
said Colonel Scott, switching to English. "From the beginning, if you would. Leave nothing out."
Kurt noticed a trace of a Scottish accent. He took a deep breath and began. "I was born in Ulm. My father worked in local government, my mother—" The colonel held up a hand and smiled like a dried prune. "I don't think I need your full life story, Muller. Please start from when you joined the Abwehr." Kurt told how, operating from Abwehr headquarters in Berlin, he had been in charge of running German agents in Ireland, and how he uncovered and joined the German resistance. He made no mention of his nefarious uncle, the late Reinhard Heydrich. "You are now a committed anti-Nazi, is that your position?" Colonel Scott was wearing round spectacles that gave him the innocent look of a child, but behind the lenses lurked a pair of eyes that betrayed a mind as sharp as a diamond. "It is. I wish to return to Germany to do whatever I can to hasten the end of the Third Reich." Colonel Scott cross-examined him about the Nazis, their leadership, their creed and policies, and the progress of the war, clearly fishing for the truth. Did Kurt harbour any affection for the party, or any lingering hopes of a German victory? Finally he said, "And you have come to us for what purpose?" "I thought I could become an agent for British intelligence." "And do what exactly?" Kurt stood for a moment to stretch his legs. He lifted a shoulder. "Whatever you wish." "Right. And how can we be sure that you are who you say you are? You could be sent here by Admiral Canaris to infiltrate and undermine our intelligence operations." "I assure you that is not the case," said Kurt. "Why should I believe you?" "I have brought something that may help, a token of my good faith," said Kurt. "I can give you a list of call signs used by German agents." "These are agents operating in England?" "Many of them would be. The call signs I have are allocated to agents as they are deployed all over the world. The list includes call signs in operation now and some that will be used in the future." "And how will these be of value to us?" "I was a signalman with the Abwehr. Believe me, Colonel, they will be of value to your code-breaking teams." Colonel Scott adjusted his glasses. "Where are these call signs? We found nothing like that among your belongings." Kurt tapped the side of his head. "I'm a mathematician, Colonel. I have them committed to memory." The colonel left the room and returned with a single sheet of paper and a pencil, and Kurt wrote out the call signs that he had liberated from the Abwehr, adding 2 columns of variations. When he had completed the list, he handed it to the colonel. "These are the call signs of 30 agents, 10 to 12 in use, the rest waiting to be allocated to future German agents overseas. As you can see, each has 2 variations that will be rotated in random order." The colonel folded the paper carefully and left the room with it. A Tommy entered, set up his camera, and took 2 head-and-shoulder photographs of Kurt, full face and profile, with Kurt holding a piece of cardboard with a number stenciled on it. When the photographer had finished, a different soldier entered and took down Kurt's details: height, eye color, distinguishing features, scars, tattoos, etc. He also took a full set of Kurt's fingerprints. Kurt felt like a criminal. All that was missing was a charge sheet and a pair of handcuffs. The colonel returned, carrying a folder. "It will take a while to verify those call signs," he said. "Is there anything else you can tell me in support of your story?" Kurt said, "You know that Reinhard Heydrich was ambushed and attacked in Prague on the 27th of May last year. He died on June the 4th. Scott nodded. "I played a small hand in that." Kurt explained how he had advanced knowledge of the assassination attempt, but had done nothing to prevent it. "That was helpful," said the colonel, pursing his lips. "But the reprisals were horrific." Kurt had read about the Nazi reprisals. The Czech village of Lidice had been obliterated, and every male over 16 years of age massacred. The women and children were taken to labor camps. The village was leveled, leaving nothing but rubble. Kurt said, "I read about that in the newspapers. Do you know how many were killed? The reports I read gave no numbers."
No one knows for certain, but we estimate over 500 people must have died as a direct result of Heydrich's death. The news was broadcast from Berlin. They made no secret of it. Once again, guilt and shame weighed heavily on Kurt as they had when he first...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?